Good afternoon. It's Monday, the 9th of April 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. Joining me in the studio today, Patrick Henningsen from 21st Century Wire. Welcome to the programme, Patrick.
Great to be with you, Mike.
And also joining us today, and welcome to the programme, is Professor Piers Robinson. Welcome to the programme, Piers. You are involved, just as by way of introduction, you're involved with a working group on Syria, and particularly looking at disinformation or bogus information in the media. Just give us a little bit about that.
Well, this is called the Working Group on Syria Propaganda and Media, and there's about 25 academics involved in it. Primarily, it's just in its early days, but it's been set up to look at a whole range of issues in relation to the war on Syria, but with a focus on propaganda and information operations, and also at mainstream media coverage. And we sort of expect over time that different academics will pursue different research agendas, some people focusing more on the media, some focusing more on propaganda and info ops. And really, the idea is ultimately to generate some sort of high quality academic papers and so on, and also to be a sort of a source for journalists as well, to get some reasonably objective analysis into the news, which is something which has been sorely lacking in the last 7 years in relation to Syria. So yeah, that's the organisation or the working group we have set up, and it has a website which people can look at. Not too much on it at the moment, but stuff will go on to it over time.
Okay, so 25 academics. That's perhaps surprising to quite a number of people that academics want to get involved in this type of project. So, I mean, are you finding that there is enthusiasm within the academic community to do that?
Well, I think that there is a degree of caution over Syria. There's a degree of caution in general about looking at the war on terror and so on, but there's a lot of caution over Syria because it's an ongoing event. There's an awful lot of flack and heat taken by people who do start to talk about Syria, attacks, etc., smears, and so on. And I think that does caution academics. But, at the end of the day, this is such a major conflict, and it's such a, as it were, data-rich conflict. Yeah, that sort of it really cries out to be analysed. And so I think the more confident, brave academics are sort of willing to sort of get involved and look into these issues and so on. But for sure, it's a tricky thing to do, and one incurs a lot of criticism, or I wouldn't call it criticism because I don't think it's particularly legitimate. You incur attacks and flack and so on from various corners who would perhaps rather have you not asking these questions and not investigating this area. But that makes it all the more reason for us to push through and to make sure this does get on the research agenda of mainstream academia. It will always take time. It takes a few years for these things to start producing material and so on. But I think over time, sort of it will draw more attention, and more academics will become involved when they start to sort of sit and reflect upon what we've been witnessing for the last 7 years.
Just before we move on to Skripal, what is the URL for the website?
Oh, that's a good question. Off the top of my head, I'm not quite sure. If you type in working group Syria Propaganda Media, that should come up fairly quickly. This sort of website.
Okay.
I think that's pretty much it. It's the URL, yeah. But type in those words and it will come up. Okay. Or check on my Twitter feed, and I've got a link to it there.
Okay, super. Thank you, Piers. Now, look, one of the things that the working group has done is to be right behind the investigation into the Novichok claims by the British government and so on. But I wanted to start off with this Express article. I believe this is from Friday, Patrick. Revealed the bombshell Russian message intercepted on day of Skripal poisonings. Well, this article claims to have a pretty impressive set of evidence with regard to secret intelligence.
Yeah, this is from yesterday. I believe it's April 8th. But yeah, so this is the new case, Mike. So now they're claiming that the intelligence sources are claiming that Syria is now involved in the Skripal attempted assassination here. This is an electronic message apparently was sent from to Moscow from Damascus. So from Russian to Russian, from Damascus to Moscow. And so apparently the package has been delivered, was the message that was intercepted by the RAF listening station in Cyprus, and then was somehow decoded or transcribed or processed through GCHQ, and the head of MI6, Alex Younger, patted the station operative on the back saying, "Well done, lads, well done, case solved." So now we have the Syrian link to the Skripal story. And so this article goes down. There's a number of interesting things in this article, Mike, one of which is that quotes from British officials, I don't know if you have any of those quotes handy, but that we don't have time to go through and wait for the OPCW investigation to take place. And that's why we had to basically show our European partners, our NATO allies, this intelligence that we intercepted 2 days well, apparently this was intercepted 2 days before the attempted Skripal poisoning assassination, and they just ran with it to their partners and said, look, we've got actionable some intelligence here, signals intelligence, and combined with human intelligence, and therefore we have a compelling case. We don't have to wait for the OPCW to go through the forensic investigation because we know who was responsible, and that was Russia. So those quotes are in this article. So that, from a policy point of view, I think is really significant.
Piers, where do we go with that? Because this is we have had secret intelligence from the intelligence services before, which have led us into conflicts before. Is this claim that a signal was intercepted, which said the package has been delivered? Is this sufficient evidence to make any claims about who was responsible for anything, really?
Well, I don't think in itself it's sufficient by any means. I mean, it's worth keeping in mind the broader context in which this newspaper story, and there's several others out there as well, which I think sort of raised this issue of additional information that the British government had, which enabled them to point the finger at Russia. And obviously, these news reports are coming out in the immediate aftermath of Porton Down making a statement that they were unable to verify that the nerve agent, which they claim they detected, was actually produced in Russia. And of course, as everybody's aware, that ran against what the British government had really suggested very, very strongly, which was that Porton Downs was the confirming body in terms of confirming this nerve agent was definitely produced in Russia. It wasn't just a Russian nerve agent, but it's also one that's produced there. Certainly the tweets from the Foreign Office and Boris Johnson's statements in public seem to suggest that. Now that's unraveled somewhat because Porton Down have clarified and said, well, we can't confirm it's from Russia. And I think these articles that we see coming out now, we always have to show due diligence and be skeptical about information coming from governments, especially in terms of high foreign affairs, but even more so in the case of this, because there's one possibility here is that this is an attempt to maintain the narrative, attempt to maintain the line that the British government is pushing, which is that Russia must be responsible for what happened in Salisbury. And reference to intelligence reports, these things are vulnerable, as we saw in the case of Iraq, to overinterpretation by intelligence agencies, vulnerable to misinformation being passed up by sources, given the information the intelligence services want to hear in this circumstance. And we've been here before with all of the kind of problems which emerge out of that for creating really a continually distorted understanding of what is objectively known. So I treat all of this with great care. It needs to be looked at very, very carefully what they're putting forward. And I still see, I mean, maybe there is a kind of rationale somewhere in there, but I still see no reason why there should not be a clear commitment to an objective, forensic, legal, etc., police analysis of what went on, overseen by an international organization, the OPCW possibly, and to allow that to take its course before you start pointing the finger, especially given the stakes that are involved here. There's no reason why that can't be allowed to happen, and that is what should be allowed to happen in this situation. And then we can all be allowed to sift through the evidence being put forward, and we can have some kind of objective analysis on what's going on, rather than what we have at the moment, which is, a rush to judgment, and what appears to be reasonably clear that this is at the very least an exploitation of circumstances for much broader political purposes.
Any questions?
Well, I just want to say, if you go back to that article, there is the scientist there who defected from Russia and published a book in 2008, State Secrets, where he published the formula for the alleged Novichok. And according to Vil Mirzayanov, this is the man that provided really the bulk of the intelligence, or the sort of smoking gun, as it were. When this story broke, he said that Novichok was the deadliest nerve agent known to man, 10 times more lethal, in fact, than VX nerve gas, and he only gave them a couple of days to live at the time. And by the way, as Neil Clark pointed out yesterday on his Twitter feed, the Times ran a headline that, in fact, Sergei Skripal had died on March the 12th. So he's now backtracking, Vil Mirzayanov, saying that, no, this Novichok, it's not quite as deadly as we said before. It's less deadly. There's actually a 4-hour delay time before the Novichok kicks in, and it won't really kill you in most cases, or in this case. I'm not sure really where this is going, but certainly this is a completely reworking of the initial storyline. Now you're seeing rearguard action come into play. It's incredible, Mike.
Piers, you were talking about objectivity and actually knowing what happened here. The bottom line is we still don't actually know what happened. We've got many stories about what might have happened, and some of them even competing stories. This Express article saying that as little as 15 milliliters would have been all that was needed by the agents wherever they left it. But we have the story that the Skripals apparently were infected on a door at their home, and then went off and had a meal in a restaurant, and went for a walk in the park, and sat down on a park bench, and only then started exhibiting serious symptoms. There is no objectively credible evidence for anything from start to finish, really, here, is there?
Well, I think Patrick was right to pick up on Mirzayanov and the Russian exile, who is understood to be the source for many of the claims regarding Novichok, dating back to the early 1990s, and then in relation to the book that he put out in 2008. And that's one of the things that myself and others in the working group who are looking at this issue, and also looking at it in the context of CB, or chemical biological events in Syria, is looking into the history of Mirzayanov and looking at the history of this narrative regarding Novichok. And what is clear to us, what we have managed to establish so far, is that there are inconsistencies in the story that he puts forward. We also know that the compounds he identifies in his 2008 book were known, to Western intelligence services. We know that the Americans synthesized one of the compounds in 1998. And we know from WikiLeaks documents that there was express orders to discourage discussion, of Mirzayanov's book at OPCW meetings. So there's a sense in which the Western governments know a lot more about this Novichok than they've actually let on. There's questions over the consistency of Mirzayanov's story over 20 years. And there's also another critical point. He's the governor in exile of the Tatar region in Russia. So there's a political dimension to Mirzayanov, which is not really generally known. But that, of course, raises the question as to how reliable, or whether he should be treated as a kind of independent sort of source of information regarding this. And certainly, as you, Mike, pointed out, the story regarding the lethality of Novichok has changed since over the last few weeks. And all of it, at the end of the day, we don't know for sure. There are some things we know for sure, which is that we know more about these compounds than has been suggested so far. We don't know exactly what the reality behind all of this, and more importantly than that, yeah, we don't know the details, and really everything which has come to light so far, even this latest stuff coming out in the Express articles, simply begs more and more questions over this, and I think in some ways makes the initial starting position of the British government less and less tenable, in the sense that they were pointing the finger directly at Russia. So I think more and more questions, and I'm sort of suspecting this one is going to run and run, because there are so many problems and inconsistencies which need looking into regarding the official narrative.
Piers, just to reiterate, a great piece published on Tim Hayward's blog, which is really a summary of the work that you're doing with your research group. And just to reiterate, the term Novichok it's not a scientific term. It's a representative. It's a narrative type term. It's spoken of by Boris Johnson and by the newfound experts in the media as being this a deadly class of nerve agents, but in fact it's not. And I just wanted quickly, if you can just reiterate that.
Yeah. I think there is a strong possibility that the label Novichok is a bit of spin, a bit of info ops there, in terms of creating a name which can be associated in people's minds with Russia. Certainly the Russians deny ever having any programs specified or called Novichok. And there are instead these compounds, and there's a variety of programs from the 70s and 80s which might have had variations of the term Novichok. But that's not the Novichok that Mirzayanov was talking about. He was talking in 92 about a very distinct fourth generation nerve agent which is highly, highly potent, and which could be created out of chemicals or compounds which could be found in an agricultural setting, etc. And I think sort of the indications are that the Novichok has just been this very crude kind of label which has been used by Western governments, the Russians deny it, in order to sort of direct attention and massage the evidence in the direction of Russia. So yeah, that's and I think that's one of the things that we're looking at, is this question of how much the entire issue of the fourth generation nerve agents and this Novichok allegations from the West is possibly, okay, because we haven't established for sure yet, but is possibly best understood as a kind of part of an information operation on the part of the West at the end of the day, that this was a card which was going to get pulled out of the hat, pulled out at some point and played against Russia. And I suppose, if I was to say a final thing on all of this, and as I'm sure you both appreciate, that this needs to be understood in a broader context of what's happening in the international system. It needs to be understood in a broader context of the drive to demonize Russia over what's going on right this moment in Syria as well. So, if what we see in terms of the exploitation of this event is to do with these broader propaganda drives and the broader political objectives surrounding marginalizing Russia further, possibly taking us to a point of escalation and direct conflict with Russia in Syria or in other contexts, I think that's the kind of area, that's what we need to keep in mind when we're sort of focusing on the details of Skripal. Was it on the door handle? Was it in the porridge, etc.? These various things which have come out over time. That there's bigger processes at work here, and I think it would be naive to think that it's the Skripal and all of this issue is just isolated in any sense. This is being at the very least used as part of some pretty serious and some extremely worrying developments in the international system.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Piers. Now, on the 27th of May in Leeds, Media on Trial is taking place. It's the third Media on Trial event, and Piers, you'll be speaking at this once again. Details are at mediaontrial.uk, and tickets are available now. Do you know what the theme of your talk is going to be just yet?
Well, I think one of the issues that I think that the entire event is being framed around is this question of journalism and its complicity or its relationship to terrorism, etc. And I think what I will try and do in terms of my introduction is to try to sort of give a sense of what we know now about how, in the context of a war on terror, which of course we've all been told is about fighting Islamic fundamentalism, fighting religious extremism, etc., that actually in the case of Syria, we've been involved in a conflict where we have been supporting groups who we have claimed to be trying to fight and trying to oppose. And so there's a stark inconsistency and breakdown in the narrative, I think, from the West over the war on terror. And so what I'll try and do is just talk through what we know from Chilcot Inquiry about how the war on terror was understood by some people in Washington as just a way of mobilizing public support for other kinds of action in the international system, and also talk about what we know about, in the case of Syria, the relationship between the British and the Americans and the support of extremist groups, jihadist groups in that country. To give a little bit of context so that people have a bit more of a sense when we're talking about, why we should be raising the question of, how much of it is it a problem that we see journalists and mainstream media alongside some of these groups. This arguably contravenes counterterrorism legislation, etc. So I'll try and give the broader political context and a bit of understanding about quite how sort of dirty this war is that we have been involved in, and also obviously fueled and arguably from some corners initiated in the first instance.
Okay, Piers, look, thank you very much for joining us. Now, we're going to move on to Syria now. I know you're a bit short of time, but if you can hang with us, then feel free to jump in at any point here. But let's just have a look at this from The Independent. Syria civil war, dozens of civilians killed in chemical weapons attack on Douma in eastern Ghouta, says Monitor. Well, Patrick, it's the usual sources, the white helmets, these types of people, and the usual kind of language in this. Images on social media appeared to show families, mostly women and children, filming from the mouth.
As you can see the video, we've got 3 babies and shot, fourth child there. That's it, case closed. That's all that's required. But take a look at the subtitle on the headline, Mike. U.S. State Department says it is monitoring the situation and that Russia should be blamed if chemicals were used. Now, if that is not instigatory language right out of the gate there, I don't know what is, Mike.
And the question in my mind is why, when Syria is about to have cleared out everybody from eastern Ghouta that they didn't want there, why would they pull a stunt like this?
Just as they're ending the war, someone is trying to start another one. That's, I believe, in my opinion, what we're looking at.
Piers, briefly, any thoughts on this?
Well, undoubtedly there is a pattern here of these chemical biological events occurring at particular moments in the conflict again and again. The famous red line with Obama and Ghouta, etc. And I think at this point, and this is one of the reasons why some people in the working group are looking at this, not all of us, but a few of us are looking at it, is that there's very strong indications that these are events which are, or false flag, if you want to call them that. These are events which are being used for strategic or creative strategic purposes in order to try to create escalation, or at the very least damage the sort of credibility of the Syrian government and of Russia in this conflict. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out that the rationale for such an attack at this point is very difficult to convincingly argue why the Assad regime would do that now, and so on. So what's amazing, or perhaps it's not amazing, but what's very disquieting to me is that we've had this so many times now in this conflict, and yet the mainstream media find it very, very difficult to ask the obvious questions, which is, well, who is really responsible for this? Whose interests does it serve? So I think it fits a pattern, and it fits a pattern which absolutely needs to be, if it's not going to be looked at by the mainstream media, then it needs to be looked at by academics who are going to take the time to really interrogate the evidence that there is, because it certainly doesn't look reasonable to assume that it's the Assad government in the way that the mainstream media are, and in the way that the Western governments immediately point the finger as soon as these things happen. There's probably a very different reality, and that's putting it in a nice careful academic terms.
Absolutely. And Patrick, your illustrious president had a pretty horrendous tweet as a result of these allegations of a chemical attack. You animal Assad. I wanted to highlight the comments from Colonel Pat Lang, former Defense Intelligence Agency individual. This is his blog here, Sic Semper Tyrannis. He said, this is in response to President Trump's tweet, he said, "Our beloved president has once again been watching a bit too much TV news. Does it ever occur to him to pick up the secure phone and call the watch officer at CIA, NSA or wherever and ask if they think the news reports are correct? All of these information feeds to the mainstream media and thence to the president's ears are news feeds from the propaganda apparatus of the rebels, much of it supported financially by the British government's foreign ministry and delivered through MI6. What on earth motivates the UK in this devilment?" And then, of course, there's the extreme groupthink on the part of US and European mainstream media in parroting these objectively unproven claims. He seems to have hit the nail on the head there, Patrick.
Indeed, he has. And so you see Donald Trump doing more or less a rerun of 1 year ago when the United States launched a cruise missile attack on the Shayrat Air Force Base in the Homs province of Syria. And what was the basis of that attack at the time were a couple of YouTube videos, and likely uploaded by the White Helmets themselves. That was the extent of the evidence, Mike. So the U.S. set a precedent there. Donald Trump set a new precedent, which is that war could be waged on the basis of social media. So, and here we see pretty much the same thing, although these videos are heavily edited with children holding babies, laundered through The Independent, laundered through The Guardian, laundered through the entire mainstream media apparatus. One also might ask the question, if you work in the PR field, how do they place these videos on time at each of these supposedly independent media organizations all at once, perfectly streamlined? Is there not a middleman, a person? Is there not a Bell Pottinger type PR company working hand in hand with government agencies to streamline the media coverage across the entirety of the Western media? It is truly a remarkable feat when you think about it. For any of you who work in PR, you'll know what I'm talking about.
And we'll just remind everybody, as Ron Paul has here in his tweet, that prior to becoming president, Donald Trump was absolutely in the position that we should not be attacking Syria. He seems to, well, he does blow with the wind.
Well, once again, Ron Paul hits the nail on the head, as he normally does. This was Donald Trump in September 2013 when Obama was mulling over the red line, which became a pink line and quickly dissolved. Donald Trump said, again, to our very foolish leader, do not attack Syria. If you do, many very bad things will happen. And from that fight, the U.S. gets nothing. That was Donald Trump during the Obama administration. Oh, how times have changed.
And in the meantime, Boris Johnson, writing in the Sunday Times, and his rhetoric, mainly criticism of Jeremy Corbyn, and truly Jeremy Corbyn is the Kremlin's useful idiot, is what he's saying. The Foreign Office, what did they have to say? These are very concerning reports of a chemical weapons attack with significant number of casualties, which, if correct, are further proof of Assad's brutality against innocent civilians and his backers' callous disregard for international norms. An urgent investigation is needed and the international community must respond. We call on the Assad regime and its backers, Russia and Iran, to stop the violence against innocent civilians. And Piers, my question here is, isn't that what they're doing? They are clearing Eastern Ghouta out at this moment of terrorists, and so they are absolutely doing all they can already to stop the violence against innocent civilians. I appreciate that's not quite how the Foreign and Commonwealth Office meant it, but that is what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, the inversion of reality in this case is really quite dramatic. As you described, the groups being removed from Ghouta are militant groups. They are who would fall under our definition of a terrorist group if operating in our country. They're conducting themselves in that way. And so you have got a real inversion of reality in here. We've been here before with inversions of reality, the Vietnam War being a very clear instance of that. I was going to just quickly add in before I had to go, what Trump was saying. I mean, and the other quotes that you have there, just bringing in Iran and Russia into the Syria. I mean, this all is, I think, extremely worrying that this is an indication of where we might be heading, that this is an attempt to shore up and then persist and then to escalate the kind of military aspirations that the neocons and other groups within the West have had in relation to the Middle East, and questions of are we going to end up in a conflict over Iran? Is this going to escalate at some point with Russia in other contexts, etc.? It's very worrying. It's this grouping together of these countries, all underneath this kind of allegation of chemical weapons, etc. Something to hold the high moral ground on, etc., and to then use to mobilize and justify whatever military action that they might be thinking of. So I don't want to be too alarmist, but I think we should all be extremely concerned about where we have got to now at this point in time.
Piers, thank you very much for joining us. I know you've got to run. Hopefully we'll see you back on the programme in the not too distant future, so thank you again. And Patrick, we've had a response from Vladimir, from the Russians at the very least here, talking about the gravest of consequences if any foreign power considers military action on the basis of fabricated reports of a chemical attack. Well, hardly surprising. We've already had that military action of a type anyway. Initial reports seem to suggest that it was possibly the French involved in this, but it seems like the Russian Ministry of Defense and the Syrians have settled on Israel as being responsible for the bombing of a Syrian airbase using guided missiles.
Sure. Just as we were about to turn in for the night at about 1 a.m. Early this morning, this comes through the wires, and there was speculation that this could have been a U.S. cruise missile attack. The United States has issued veiled threats. Israel has also issued them on behalf of the United States as well. So it wasn't sure. Plus, we heard information about maybe the French also being involved, because the French, as you know, Macron had drawn his ligne de rouge in January, saying that any chemical weapons attacks will be met with a fierce French response and so forth. So that France and Britain now merged. So that was a possibility. No, but reports are settling on an Israeli airstrike, guided missiles launched from Lebanese airspace into the Homs province, hitting a Syrian air installation there. And again, with regards to Israel, the justification for this categorically will always be that they are targeting Iranian assets in Syria and also Hezbollah supply lines. But in fact, if you look at the record on a lot of these airstrikes by Israel over the last 6 years, you'll see categorically that they are actually weakening Syrian air defense, weakening the Syrian infrastructure against Israeli incursions as well, but also helping the United States in its objectives to maintain air power over certain parts of Syria in order to protect, Mike, and unfortunately to protect militants in many cases. This has been the pattern. So we'll see how this develops over the next 24 hours. Be interesting.
Okay, now we want to talk a little bit about the media here, and you wanted to highlight 2 Times articles. These are search engine results. We won't say which, but everybody will recognise it, I'm sure. May battles to preserve alliance against Russia. That's one Times News article, and the other one is UK locates source of Novichok agent used in Salisbury. And your point here really is that if you look at the articles as they were originally published, here is May battles to preserve alliance against Russia on the front page of the Times. And this article was, I believe, published in exactly the same form online at the time.
Sure. So this was around April 4th. I'm not sure. Correct me if I'm slightly off on the date. But this went out on the print edition. Okay, this is a very disturbing trend. This went out in the print edition. And this article is very damaging to the to Downing Street's narrative, because it basically points out that one of the heads of the German Christian Democrats Union, a really loyal deputy, really, of Angela Merkel, Armin Laschet, he basically chastised the British government for pulling in the EU partners and the NATO partners for this coalition of solidarity based on no evidence at all. So that is the sort of May's anti-Russia alliance. And so if you go and look for this online, on the Times newspaper online, this is what you find. it's been redirected. So the URL's still there, but they've wiped the article and they've changed it to Johnson under fire after Foreign Office deletes Porton down tweet. And you might say, well, that was just a one-off, Mike, but in fact it's not. We also have this story. UK locates source of Salisbury nerve agent. They found the Russian Porton down version, the Russian secret lab where they're stockpiling Novichok. This is coming out of the Times. So arguably this was right after the Porton down admission by the executive director, Mr. Aikenhead. And so then this story comes out by the Times to try to shore up the government narrative or to deflect from the fact that the government narrative is falling to pieces. And I want to find this story online, and this is what I get. Britain and Russia set for UN showdown as Moscow denies it made nerve agent.
But the point here is that when you do the search for it, the search results show the original headline. So at some point, the online story was identical to what was published in print.
Originally it was.
And then it's been changed.
It was. So this is what the Times are doing right now. And you have to know that the Times and the Sunday Times are running point on all the propaganda for this Skripal affair. So they're running point, and who knows who's in charge of the editorial desk at the Times and the Sunday Times, but I'm telling you right now that it's not journalists who are doing it, or if they are, they're probably maybe have some dual loyalties, perhaps, we'll put it that way. But so what are the Times doing? This is a dangerous precedent, Mike, because now you don't know, there's no way to track the legacy or the genealogy of a particular story. They're literally wiping and rewriting their own history. So they're putting stuff out to get maximum public traction on the newsstands. So the propaganda goes out, penetrates into the public, crazy headlines, mad conspiracy theories, fake news, and cooked up, sexed up intelligence in most cases from anonymous sources, authorities, official sources, and then it disappears. So it's done its job, then it disappears. You can't even find it online.
No. So the RT has noticed that the Times is up to this, but I have to say in the chat box somebody's saying the Guardian does this as well. I was searching for something this morning, and the Telegraph is doing this as well.
You found the Telegraph has done it.
Right? So this is something that the mainstream media seems to be doing right across the board.
So the British press, the British mainstream press, this is now a normal practice across the British mainstream press,
and
putting print stories out and then making them disappear. In other words, putting propaganda bursts out and then covering their tracks. They're all doing it. Okay, we've just given you a few examples of this, and I'm sure our readers or people at the UK column can go and maybe send us any examples of this, screenshots and original URLs, and then a picture of the print version if you can. To put those cases together, but it's shocking.
And what the journalistic standards say about this? What's expected in the journalist community, in the media community on this?
Well, you'd think this would be at the top of the agenda of Theresa May's new crack fake news task force, or the disinfo labs being run by the many government departments, including the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. A bit ironic that they would have a disinfo lab or Department of Disinformation. I think the irony might be lost.
Counter disinformation.
Counter disinformation, which is really,
yes,
counter truth, really. But so that's a good question. Anyway, what is this? This leads into a couple of other events where we'll be speaking about this topic. I'll be speaking about this at AV9 this year.
So AV9, 4th to 7th of May, Howard House Hotel. Very few rooms still available. Do get rooms and tickets still available. Do get them and do get along if you can. Friday the 4th, Monday the 7th of May, near Milton Keynes. Alternativeview.co.uk for the details on that. And then the following weekend on the 12th in the Albert Hall in Nottingham, Dying for Good Health. A unique conference on the National Health Service, some spectacular speakers at that. Details on the UK Column events page. Do come to this and please do share it and promote it, because this is something that the British government is pretty keen not to take place, we know.
And let me just add, Nottingham is a fantastic location, Mike, because of its centrality, so very easy to get to within a decent drive from a number of different locations. So do, I think, really get out and support that event if you're able to. And bring a friend, because let's face it, the issue of health and your well-being and your family's well-being is of everybody's interest.
Absolutely.
So it's a really important event to support. This will be the first one of its type.
Absolutely. Now, let's move on to this quickly. Senseless violence. This is the Sun. Senseless violence. Stabbings in London 2018 from Walthamstow to Herne Hill to Highbury to Islington. Knife crime statistics in the UK. Now, we've been hearing this news about London being the most violent city, much more violent than New York in recent statistics. And the first question in my mind was, well, is this something new? Are the numbers rising? And the other question in my mind was what's coming? And today we found out. So here the Sun is saying that Met Police records show that 37,443 recorded knife offences and 6,694 recorded gun offences across the UK in the year up to September 2017. In London, the problem was even more pronounced than the rest of the country, with 12,980 knife crimes taking place in the capital, 2,452 more than the equivalent previous year. Knife crime across the country has risen by 21% in 12 months to September 2017. And stabbings in London are at the highest level in 6 years, with a 23% rise from the previous year. So what's coming? What's this all about? Well, here we go. The first piece of news is the Offensive Weapons Bill has been announced. This is a ban on the sale of the most dangerous corrosive products to under 18s, tough restrictions on online sale of knives. This was announced yesterday. Government is going to make it a criminal offence to possess corrosive substances in public. And publicly consult on extending stop and search powers to enable the police to search for seize acid from people carrying it in public without good reason. The Offensive Weapons Bill is going to come forward within the next couple of weeks. It's also going to make it illegal to possess certain offensive weapons like zombie knives and knuckle dusters in private. So you're not allowed to have them even if you have them in your own home.
Not even in your own home?
Not even in your own home.
Okay, this is a new level of invasion by the state into the personal space.
Okay, so the other things that they intend to bring in are stopping knives being sent to residential addresses after they're bought online, changing the legal definition for threatening with an offensive weapon to make prosecutions easier, banning the possession of a knife on a further education premises, banning rapid-firing rifles and certain powerful firearms and bump stocks, which increase a rifle's rate of fire, updating the definition of a flick knife to reflect changing weapons design. But it doesn't end there, Patrick, because I wonder, can you suggest what might be the most offensive weapon of them all?
Well, from a government's perspective, it has to be social media.
Social media. So here we are. There is the Twitter bird.
That's Rude Boy Twitter.
Yes.
Rude Boy Twitter.
Yes,
Twitter
Offensive Weapons Bill 2018. So this is echoing David Blunkett's article in the Daily Mail from last week, because the bill will also examine how social media usage can drive violent crime and focus on building the progress and relationships made with social media providers and the police to identify where they can take further preventative action relevant to tackling serious violence, because people are getting hit all the time, stabbed by the social media tweets. They're so cutting that they result in death and destruction.
Just as dangerous as a gun, apparently we're told, social media, according to the government anyway.
So
more dangerous. Right?
So Amber Rudd was giving a speech today, and she was calling on social media companies to do much more to tackle gang material hosted on their sites. So it's not just about terrorism, it's now about gang material. But it gets better. Because today, during that speech, she was launching the Serious Violence Strategy. This is a multi-million-pound commitment to steering young people away from crime and tackling violent drug-dealing gangs through the government's first serious violence strategy. £40 million of Home Office funding, a major shift in the government's response to knife crime and gun crime. And they say it strikes a balance between prevention and robust law enforcement with a new £11 million early intervention youth fund for community projects to help young people live lives free of violence. The strategy identifies the changing drugs market, in particular the devastating impact of crack cocaine, because there's been no crack cocaine on the streets for ages.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
There's plenty of everything on the streets.
As a key driver for the violence harming our communities, includes £3.6 million to establish a new national county lines coordination centre. She's going to launch the serious violence strategy at an event in London. She did that this morning. And she's going to announce that the new serious violence task force, which would bring together the voluntary sector, local government, police and other key sectors to ensure the strategy is delivering effectively. So once again, we have this merging of governance between various sectors of society. And in addition to the £40 million, they're going to provide £13 million for Trusted Relationships Fund through the Home Office, £40 million Youth Investment Fund, a £90 million of dormant accounts money. So this is big society, but the key point is, what's it all about? Early intervention, NGOs, charities. How about just offering these kids opportunities for productive jobs and futures, and maybe some way to make a living, some way to be able to afford to buy a house in London? That might be a help, would it not, instead of this nonsense?
We spoke about this on the Sunday Wire last night. Great episode if you get a chance to go and listen to it. But how about an economy? This is a bright idea, Mike. What about an economy that creates productive jobs? How about how far would that go to solving some of these problems? But or we've got £60 million for the white helmets from the British government. I think more, almost 100 million, in fact, more than any of these kids have gotten, maybe in the last decade. I don't know, over two Tory governments, but or I don't know. I guess start distributing white helmets in Britain, creating jobs that way. I guess I don't know. There's money for white helmets. That's all I know, Mike. There's lots of money for white helmets, but there's not money for anything else. Yes.
Okay. Well, look, we're just going to leave it briefly on this one very quickly, Patrick, because Brexit lacks democratic mandate. This is the whistleblower from Cambridge Analytica. Quite staggering that this young guy from the United States or Canada or wherever it is he's from is now being held up by the mainstream media as the perfect example to tell us Brits about democratic mandates and whether we should be in the European Union or not.
So who is the guy with pink hair now doing the rounds across the British media, basically lecturing Britain about how Brexit was undemocratic and there should be another referendum? This is the so-called whistleblower from Cambridge Analytica. I think you need to be suspicious of some of these people who call themselves whistleblowers, who may in fact be planted into a political situation. Let's just put it that way. I find it his whole delivery on Brexit is very scripted, very contrived, and I think people should be very suspicious as to how this person has been elevated overnight and been given prime placement across all of the major broadcast networks to be basically lobbying for a second referendum on the back of this so-called scandal with Cambridge Analytica. I personally am very suspicious about this, Mike. I don't know. It seems too good to be true. What do you think?
Well, what I think is I'm seeing an agenda building and, of course, Channel 4 News, as usual, leading because Aggregate IQ linked to Cambridge Analytica and Channel 4 News in this little video absolutely asking the question, what effect did these people have on the Brexit referendum? Did they swing the vote? This is the narrative, the next narrative which is coming along.
Listen, Cambridge Analytica, it's looking more and more like a casus belli. Okay, this ship has been set on fire by Sir Francis Drake and basically sailed right into the middle of the Spanish Armada to burn everything down. This is what this looks like to me. So I am not. But I cannot understand, Mike, how people could buy the story that this great established firm that's used by all of the establishment, defense establishment, political establishment in Britain, in the U.S., and Canada, everywhere, is somehow now going to be hung out to dry. And all of a sudden these whistleblowers emerge. And then now they're working to reverse the Brexit result. I thought Vladimir Putin made Brexit happen. I don't know. Is that not happening anymore?
Apparently that's been dropped. That's been dropped, Pat.
Wow.
Okay, that's it for today. Thank you very much for joining us, Patrick. Thank you very much to Piers Robinson for joining us. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow. If you like what we're doing, please consider taking out a subscription or making a donation, because we can only do this with your help. And thanks very much for everybody that's joined in the last few days and weeks. We will be back at the same time, as I say, tomorrow. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.